Call whoever you want. Alfred S. Root didn't just say it. He savored it. He leaned back in his navy suit, his laughter booming across the silent dining room, a sound that signaled total humiliation for the woman standing before him. He was enjoying the certainty of it. The power. The belief that she was nothing more than a punchline. But then, Sheila J. Box made the call. And when the voice on the other end spoke, the laughter died. Not slowly. Instantly. Because the man who answered that phone was someone no one in that room, least of all Alfred Root, ever expected to hear from. For 9 days, Sheila had tried everything the right way. She wrote the emails. She requested the meetings. She sat in the corporate lobby for 3 hours, holding a folder of facts about the families he was about to destroy. She waited. She asked again. No shouting. No scenes. No bitterness. Because that was the kind of woman she was. But what the CEO didn't see, as he looked at the young black waitress in the clean white shirt and black apron, was the debt she held in her pocket. He saw a waitress. He didn't see the woman who had once stood between a blade and the most feared man in the city. He didn't know that the phone she held steady against her ear was connected to Gung Jinsang, a Korean Mafia boss who never answers for anyone. Except for her. And in less than 5 minutes. The most powerful man in that building would realize he had made a very dangerous mistake. Sheila began her fight exactly where she had been taught, within the rules. For 9 days, she became a ghost haunting the sterile, glass-enclosed hallways of the Root Restaurant Group's corporate headquarters. On the first day, she arrived an hour before her shift, wearing her best pressed blouse, clutching a folder that contained the employment records and commendations of the 14 people Alfred Root had labeled as dead weight. She spoke to the receptionist, a young woman who wouldn't look her in the eye, and left a detailed message for the director of operations. The message was never returned. By the 3rd day, the silence from the top floor began to feel like a physical weight. Sheila didn't raise her voice, she simply showed up. She sat in the lobby for 4 hours, watching executives in navy suits glide past her, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. When she finally managed to corner a mid-level manager near the elevators, he didn't even stop walking. He glanced at her name tag, then at her folder, and offered a thin, pitying smile. The decision is final, Sheila. It's about the architecture of the brand. You should focus on your tables instead of paperwork you don't understand. On the 5th day, she tried the human resources department. She sat across from a woman who checked her watch every 30 seconds. Sheila spoke about Terrence, the line cook who had missed only 2 days in 12 years, and Gloria, whose veteran status was the only thing keeping her housing voucher active. The HR representative sighed, a sound of profound boredom. We appreciate your passion, the woman said, her voice devoid of any real warmth, but profitability isn't a charity. Maybe you'd be happier at a different establishment if our culture doesn't suit you. By day 7, the mockery turned from indifference to open contempt. As Sheila waited near the executive entrance, she overheard 2 junior partners laughing as they walked toward their car. The waitress is back, one whispered, not caring if she heard. She thinks a few handwritten letters can stop a multi-million-dollar restructuring. It's adorable, really. Through it all, Sheila remained a pillar of calm. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, and she didn't break. She watched and she recorded every no, every dismissal, and every smirk. She was giving them every chance to be human, to see the people behind the profits. But as the sun set on the 9th day and the security guard politely asked her to leave the lobby for the final time, Sheila felt a cold, iron-like clarity settle in her chest. She had tried the decent way. She had walked through every open door only to have them slammed in her face. As she walked back toward the restaurant, her hand brushed against the phone in her pocket. The right way was over. It was time for the only way that was left. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen hummed with a frantic, rhythmic energy that Alfred Root never saw from his reserved table in the dining room. To him, the food appeared as if by magic, but to Sheila, this room was the heartbeat of the building, and right now, that heart was arrhythmic with fear. She stood by the pass-through, watching the people she had spent years protecting, the ones whose names had been dismissed as overhead in the corporate meetings she had just left. In the corner, Gloria was mechanically prepping the garnish, her hands moving with a precision that belied the tremor in her shoulders. Gloria had been the soul of this kitchen for 15 years. She was 3 months away from the veteran status that would finally secure her a permanent housing voucher, a dream that would vanish the moment her employment was terminated. Sheila watched her wipe a stray tear with the back of a flour-dusted hand, her eyes fixed on a small, framed photo of her grandson taped to the stainless steel prep table. Near the industrial sinks, Terence was scrubbing pots with a ferocity that spoke of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Terence was a father of 3 who worked a second job at a warehouse just to keep his daughters in a safe school district. He had finally reached a point of stability, a fragile piece that was now being pulled out from under him like a cheap rug. When he caught Sheila's eye, he didn't ask for updates, he just shook his head slowly, the exhaustion etched into the deep lines around his mouth. Further down the line, an elderly couple, Edmund and Celeste, worked side by side as they had for decades. They were the unproductive ones the junior partners had laughed about. They moved slower now, their joints stiff from 40 years of service, but they moved in a perfect, silent synchronicity. They were waiting for their son to return from his deployment to move them into a retirement community, but that was months away. Without this paycheck, the bridge to their rest would collapse. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of searing protein and the heavy, unspoken weight of 14 different tragedies. These weren't just employees. They were a tapestry of survival. As Sheila watched them, she realized that their silence wasn't born of submission, but of a profound, weary dignity. They were still doing their jobs, still plating perfection for a man who didn't think they were worth the ink on their own pink slips. Sheila felt the folder in her hand, the one the managers had called adorable, and her grip tightened. She looked at Gloria's shaking hands and Terence's bowed head, and the last of her hesitation evaporated. They had done everything right, and it hadn't been enough. Now, she would do what was necessary. The memory always returned to her in the same sharp, metallic scent of rain and motor oil. It had been 4 years since that Tuesday night when the city was drowning under a relentless downpour. Sheila had been taking a shortcut through a narrow alley behind a cluster of shipping containers, her shift ended and her mind already on the morning's bills. She hadn't been looking for trouble, but trouble had already found the man slumped against a rusted dumpster. Gung Jin Sang, a man whose name was usually whispered with a shudder in the city's darkest corners, looked remarkably small in the shadows. He was clutching a deep, jagged wound in his side, his expensive silk shirt stained a terrifying shade of black under the flickering street lamp. 2 men were approaching from the mouth of the alley, their footsteps heavy and purposeful, the low light glinting off the steel in their hands. Sheila could have run. She could have melted back into the rain and pretended she had seen nothing. Instead, she had stepped into the light. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a voice that carried the weight of someone who had never been afraid of the dark. She had used the industrial trash bins to create a deafening, metallic clamor that echoed like gunfire in the narrow space, and she had stood over the fallen man with a defiance that made the attackers hesitate just long enough for the distant wail of a siren to turn their courage into flight. For 3 hours, she had stayed in that oil-slicked alley. She had used her own scarf to bind his wound, pressing down with all her weight to keep his life from leaking onto the pavement. She hadn't asked his name, and she hadn't looked for a reward. She had simply talked to him in a steady, rhythmic hum, keeping him conscious as the cold seeped into their bones. When his people finally arrived, ghost-like figures in black sedans who moved with terrifying precision, Jin Sang had gripped her wrist with a strength that surprised her. He had looked at the young woman in the damp waitress uniform, really looked at her, seeing a courage that didn't belong in a service job. He hadn't offered money, he knew instinctively that wouldn't be the right currency. Instead, he had handed her a small, obsidian black card with a single number embossed in gold. "You didn't see a monster tonight," he had rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "You saw a man. And because you stayed, I will answer whenever you call. No matter the time. No matter the cost." Sheila had tucked that card into the back of her locker and left it there for 4 years. She had wanted to believe she would never need the kind of shadow he cast. But as she stood in the kitchen of the restaurant, watching the people she loved prepare for their own destruction, she realized the debt wasn't hers to keep. It belonged to Gloria, Terence, and the others. It was time to collect. The heavy oak doors of the executive suite felt like the entrance to another world, one where the air was filtered and the chaos of the kitchen was a distant, irrelevant hum. Sheila did not knock, she simply pushed them open, her black apron a stark, dark contrast against the cream-colored carpet. Alfred Root was leaning back in his navy chair, a glass of amber liquid in one hand and a gold pen in the other, ready to sign the documents that would effectively erase 14 lives. He didn't look up at first. "I believe I made myself clear to the manager, Sheila. I'm busy with the architecture of the new launch. I'm not here as a waitress, Mr. Root," Sheila said, her voice steady and resonant in the quiet room. "I'm here as a person. And I'm asking you to look at me, and the people downstairs, the same way." Root finally looked up, a slow, amused smirk spreading across his face. He set the pen down and gestured to the chair opposite him, though his body language was mocking rather than inviting. "A person? Sheila, in this industry, there are assets and there are liabilities. You are currently a liability that is taking up my time. What could you possibly say that hasn't been written in those tiresome letters you've been leaving in the lobby?" "I'm asking for 60 days, Sheila replied, ignoring the jab. 60 days for Gloria to hit her veteran milestone. 60 days for Terence to find a shift that doesn't leave his children alone at night. Just 2 months of mercy to prove that this company has a soul." Root let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that hit the walls like a slap. He stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city he believed he owned. "Mercy? You're talking about sentimentality, not business. You see a family, I see a spreadsheet that needs cleaning. You've spent 9 days acting like a martyr, haunting my building as if your presence changes the math." He turned back to her, his eyes cold and dismissive. "You're a punchline, Sheila. A waitress who thinks she's a social worker. It's adorable, really, but the joke is over. You have 5 minutes to clear your locker before security escorts you out." Sheila didn't flinch. She watched the way his navy suit caught the light, the way he preened in his own arrogance. He had been given the chance to be a man, and he had chosen to be a titan. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of her final decision. "I tried the decent way, Alfred," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. The shift in her tone made his smile falter, just for a second. "I really did." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her phone. The obsidian black card was no longer in her locker, the number was already saved in her contacts. She didn't look at him again as she pressed the call button. She just waited for the voice of the man who never answered for anyone else. Sheila did not retreat to the privacy of the employee break room or the shadows of the alley. Instead, she walked with a slow, deliberate grace into the center of the main dining room, where the lunchtime rush was at its peak. The air was thick with the clink of crystal and the low, confident chatter of the city's elite. Alfred Root had followed her out, his face still flushed with the adrenaline of his own cruelty, wanting to ensure every guest witnessed the final removal of the disruptive waitress. "Go ahead, Sheila," Root announced, his voice carrying over the crowd, drawing every eye in the room. "The stage is yours. Let's see which imaginary savior is going to stop me." A few of his associates at a nearby table chuckled, leaning in to watch the spectacle. The kitchen staff had begun to filter out from behind the swinging doors, their faces pale, standing like ghosts along the perimeter of the room. Sheila didn't look at Root. She didn't look at the mocking stares of the diners. She held the phone to her ear, her expression as calm as a deep well, and pressed the final digit. The ringing tone was short, only twice, before the connection was made. There was no hello, no standard greeting of a busy man. There was only a heavy, expectant silence on the other end of the line, followed by a voice that sounded like tectonic plates shifting. It was a voice the city's tabloids speculated about but never captured, a voice that carried the weight of absolute, unchallengeable authority. "It has been 4 years," the voice said. It wasn't loud, yet it possessed a resonant quality that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the restaurant. "I need the favor," Jean sang, Sheila said. Her voice was quiet, but in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the dining room, it rang out like a bell. At the mention of the name, the laughter at Root's table didn't just fade, it evaporated. The CEO's hand, which had been resting casually on the back of a chair, went rigid. The color began to drain from his face, turning a sickly, translucent gray. He knew that name. Everyone in the city's upper echelons knew the name Gung Jinsang, not as a businessman or a peer, but as the shadow that moved beneath the city, the man whose reach was longer than any law. "Tell me where," the voice commanded. "The Root Group flagship." "On 5th, Sheila replied. 5 minutes, the voice said. The line went dead with a soft click. Sheila lowered the phone, her hands steady, and looked Alfred Root directly in the eyes. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute, so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby sounded like a hammer against an anvil. The mocking smiles were gone, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. The punchline had just summoned a storm, and for the first time in his life, Alfred Root realized he was standing in the middle of an open field. The 5 minutes that followed felt like a slow-motion descent into a deep, freezing lake. Inside the restaurant, the usual frantic music of the lunch rush, the clattering of silverware, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmuring of 100 private conversations, had died out completely. Guests who had been halfway through a bite of steak sat frozen, their forks suspended in midair. The waitstaff stood in a jagged line near the kitchen, their breath coming in shallow, synchronized hitches. Everyone was looking at the front door. Alfred Root was no longer laughing. He stood behind his velvet-lined hostess stand, his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of bone. He kept adjusting his navy lapels, a nervous, involuntary habit of a man trying to remind himself of his own status. He looked at Sheila, who remained standing in the center of the floor, as still and constant as a lighthouse. He wanted to speak, to bark an order, to reclaim his territory, but the words seemed to have dissolved in his throat. Then, the heavy glass doors at the entrance didn't just open, they seemed to give way. A tall, sharp silhouette cut through the bright afternoon sunlight streaming in from the street. The figure was backlit, a dark void of absolute presence that made the expansive lobby feel suddenly cramped. He didn't enter with a crowd of shouting men or a display of weapons. He walked alone, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the polished marble, a sound that echoed like a heartbeat in the vacuum of the room. As he stepped out of the glare, the details of the man emerged. He wore a black wool coat that seemed to absorb the light around it, and his face was a mask of terrifying, weathered calm. This was Gung Jinsang. He didn't look at the opulence of the gold-leafed ceiling or the terrified faces of the city's elite. His eyes moved through the room with a predatory efficiency, dismissing everything and everyone until they landed on the young woman in the black apron. The air in the restaurant didn't just feel thin. It felt charged, as if a lightning strike were imminent. A wealthy socialite at a corner table accidentally dropped her crystal water glass. It shattered against the floor with a sound like a gunshot, but no one flinched. No one even turned their head. Every soul in the building was anchored to the man in the black coat as he came to a halt 3 paces from Sheila. He didn't bow, and he didn't smile. He simply stood there, an omen made of flesh and blood, waiting for her to speak. The architecture of power that Alfred Root had built his life upon wasn't just cracking, it was vanishing in the shadow of a man who didn't play by the rules of spreadsheets and navy suits. Alfred Root's grip on the hostess stand didn't just loosen, it failed. His fingers slid uselessly against the polished wood as if he had forgotten how to hold himself upright. The navy suit, which had looked so sharp and impenetrable only moments ago, now seemed several sizes too large for a man who was visibly shrinking. He tried to swallow, but his throat had turned to sand. He knew that face. He had seen it once, from a distance, at a gala where the city's most powerful politicians had cleared a path as if parting for a ghost. Gung Jinsang didn't move toward the CEO. He didn't have to. The distance between them was filled with a silence so heavy it felt like a physical pressure against the lungs. The mafia boss kept his hands in the pockets of his black wool coat, his gaze never leaving Sheila's face for a second, treating the billionaire developer as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture in his way. "Mr. Root," Sheila said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade through silk. "I believe you were explaining the architecture of the brand to me." Root's mouth opened, but only a dry, stuttering sound came out. He looked at Jinsang, then at the obsidian black phone Sheila still held, then at the kitchen staff who were watching him from the shadows. The arrogant lean, the dismissive pointing finger, the booming laughter, it had all evaporated, replaced by a frantic, jagged terror. He looked like a man who had been playing with a toy boat only to realize he was suddenly at the mercy of the deep, dark ocean. I didn't realize," Root finally managed to rasp, his voice losing its architecture, every layer of comfort and power stripped away. He looked at the floor, unable to meet Jinsang's eyes. "I didn't know you had such friends." Jinsang finally turned his head. It was a slow, predatory movement. He didn't speak to Root, he looked through him, as if evaluating a structural flaw in a building marked for demolition. The CEO's knees actually buckled, and he had to reach out to steady himself against a nearby table, rattling the fine china and sending a silver spoon clattering to the floor. The sound was deafening. The diners, the elite, the powerful, the untouchable, watched in a state of collective paralysis. They were seeing the apex of their world. A man who believed money was the ultimate shield, realized that there was a currency older and more dangerous than any he possessed. Root's confident body language had completely collapsed into a posture of desperate, sweating submission. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was just a man who had realized, too late, that the waitress he had called a punchline was the only person in the room with the power to save him. Gung Jinsang did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply walked toward the head table, the sound of his leather soles on the marble floor marking the seconds of Root's descending relevance. He pulled out a chair, the very one Root had used to anchor his authority, and gestured for Sheila to sit. It was a silent, devastating command. The billionaire CEO stood frozen as the waitress he had tried to erase took the seat of honor in his own establishment. Jinsang stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of the chair, his presence forming an unbreakable wall of shadow. He finally looked at Root, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. "You see a uniform," Jinsang said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal chandeliers. "You see someone who brings you plates and takes your dismissals. You see a punchline. But I see the woman who stood in a dark alley 4 years ago and chose to bleed with a stranger rather than walk away. I see the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from me except justice for people you don't even think are human." Root tried to look away, but the weight of the moment held his gaze. He looked at Sheila, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He saw the unwavering iron in her eyes, the quiet dignity that his money could never buy. He saw that she wasn't just a part of the architecture of his brand, she was the foundation he had been too blind to recognize. "The price of this seat is high, Alfred," Jinsang continued, his tone devoid of any emotion. "You told her to call whoever she wanted. She called me. Now, you will look at her. You will hear the names of the 14 people you tried to discard. And you will understand that your power only exists as long as people like her allow you to keep it. Root's arrogance didn't just break, it dissolved. He was no longer the master of the room. He was a man standing in the wreckage of his own ego, forced to confront the reality that the woman he had mocked was the most valuable person in the building. He looked at the kitchen staff, then back at Sheila, and for the first time, the architecture of his world felt small, fragile, and utterly hollow. He didn't just see a waitress anymore, he saw a person of immense, terrifying value, and the realization made his hands shake with a genuine, heavy-handed shame. The silence that followed was not the cold, empty silence of fear, but the heavy, transformative stillness of a debt being settled. Alfred Root stood before the table, his gaze fixed on the floor, his posture broken by the weight of a reality he had spent a career ignoring. When he finally looked up, the architecture of his arrogance had completely collapsed. His voice, once a booming instrument of dismissal, was now a quiet, hollow rasp. 60 days, Root said, the words costing him more than any financial loss ever could. Real help. Not just an extension, but funding, relocation assistance, and guaranteed placements for every member of the staff. He paused, his eyes flickering toward the kitchen doors where the staff stood watching. I didn't see them. I genuinely stopped noticing that I was dealing with people. I am sorry, Sheila. I'm sorry. Sheila did not offer a smile of triumph, nor did she look for an apology. She simply nodded once, a gesture of quiet, final recognition. Hold on to that feeling, Mr. Root, she said softly. Don't let the comfort of that navy suit make you forget it again. Gung Jinsang stood for a moment longer, his shadow stretching across the marble floor like a promise kept. He looked at Sheila, a brief softening in his hard, weathered expression that only she could see, before he turned and walked out. He left as he had arrived. Without ceremony, a dark force returning to the city's periphery, leaving the air in the restaurant feeling lighter, as if a storm had finally broken. The guests began to stir, the low hum of conversation returning as the immediate threat of the shadow vanished, but the atmosphere had changed. The social hierarchy of the room had been permanently rearranged. Sheila stood up from the seat of honor and took a slow, deep breath. She reached into her apron pocket, tucked the obsidian black phone away, and smoothed the fabric of her white shirt. She walked toward the kitchen, where Gloria was no longer trembling and Terence stood with his head held high. She didn't need to say the words, they saw the victory in the way she moved. Sheila picked up a discarded tray from a side table, balanced it on her fingertips, and stepped back into the dining room. She had won them time, she had won them security, and she had restored a standard of dignity that no CEO could ever take away again. As she moved toward her first table, Sheila J. Box was no longer just a waitress in a black apron. She was the steady, iron heart of her community, and she had people waiting.